I hope everyone is enjoying your lunch. You are now in the lunch keynote session. We're going to start in just a moment. One of the things that we did want to thank is our sponsors, so the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. If we could just have a round of applause for them for being the sponsor for this lunch. So we have a very unique honor of actually having another speaker from outside of the state of Oregon. Reese Roth is from the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure, and I had a unique opportunity of meeting and briefly working with him during our Special Public Works Committee that we had a year and a half ago, and some great work that we did. Completely impressed. I hope you are blown away and appreciate the words he has to say, and really inspires us to think about the future of infrastructure in the Northwest. Please welcome Reese Roth with the Sustainable Infrastructure.
Whatever it takes.
Okay, well, Daniel tells me that was Imagine Dragons. What's it called again?
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. I love it. And I said I would dance if he sang, but he refused to sing. So it's wonderful to be here. As Daniel mentioned, I live in Washington State, your neighbor to the north. I was born and bred and spent most of my days living in Washington State, but I got some really deep family roots in Oregon, so I love Oregon. I care deeply about Oregon. And in fact, when I started the Center for Sustainable Infrastructure 5 or 6 years ago, we baked into the very DNA of our nonprofit organization this idea of building sort of the metaphorical bridges between Washington and Oregon and making the Pacific Northwest a global center for innovation in infrastructure, helping infrastructure decision makers and policy makers to not only innovate, but to spend smarter and get better outcomes from the billions of dollars that we spend on infrastructure systems every year. So I'm so thrilled to be here and at the first Oregon Infrastructure Summit. I usually point out how most people take infrastructure totally for granted. Not you guys. You guys really understand what it takes to deliver the conveniences of flushable toilets and water supply at the tap and electricity at the outlet and all that infrastructure that makes all that possible. And everybody kind of prances through life and doesn't really give it much of a thought at all. But we're really living off a legacy from our grandparents' generation that provided just really quality, excellent infrastructure that makes our communities hum. I mean, it's really the lifeblood of our communities, even though people don't realize it, but you can't have a thriving local economy without quality infrastructure. It's really key to local resilience. It's key to public health and environmental quality, and certainly quality of life. So I'll kind of jump through that part because you guys understand that and get to the, I guess this is sponsored by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and Portland. So let's get to the dollars here. So the multi-billion-dollar question for Oregon infrastructure has to do with the fact that a lot of times we think about, we need to invest in our infrastructure. We need new sources of money. We need the feds to start a new infrastructure investment program. But our infrastructure providers in the Northwest are already collecting and spending billions and billions and billions of dollars every year on infrastructure systems. Water, wastewater, roads, bridges, energy, waste management, etc. And so the multi-billion-dollar question is, how do we get the most value possible for the people who are paying those bills for our communities from the billions and billions that we're spending? How do we get smarter about how we spend money on infrastructure so that we can get better outcomes? Smarter spending, it's really about optimizing the long-term community ROI. These are multi-decadal investments, right? When we invest in infrastructure facilities and our systems, these can be 20, 30, even 50-year design lives. So it's really important that we think about the ROI over that whole life cycle. Not just, go for the cheapest. Affordability is essential, but that doesn't mean cheap. We have to look at sort of the upfront capital costs and also the cost to operate and maintain these systems for 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future. And we're really creating a legacy for our children and grandchildren every time we make investment decisions about our infrastructure. So how do we get better outcomes? Affordability on the life cycle, terrific environmental performance, more resiliency in the face of the likely hazards that are coming down the pipe in our different communities. And then how do we generate the most possible local benefits, economic vitality, social benefits, helping bootstrap people from pathways out of poverty, and environmental quality, water, etc. Oh, and I had a little, let's see if I can go backwards there. Kind of in the fine print there, it says, this is something that I'm a little worried that this is blasphemous, and I'm worried the roof's gonna open up, the sky's gonna, lightning bolt's gonna come down and knock me off the stage for saying this, but I really do think that this is, in our polarized, partisan, divided world that we're living in, this really is a bipartisan opportunity. Communities of all shapes and sizes, whether it's the neighborhoods of our big cities or the growing suburban towns, or if it's a struggling small town, quality infrastructure is the lifeblood of our communities. It matters so much, and this is an area where we all want smarter spending. We all want better outcomes from our infrastructure investments, no matter whether we vote 80% red or 80% blue or some purple hue in between. We all need quality infrastructure. So this is something that potentially we can come together around. But innovation is required. I love this little quote from Peter Binney. He won the American Society for Civil Engineers President's Medal a few years back. We're making decisions today that we'll live with for 50 years. And we can't keep doing things the way we always have. So he's speaking to his fellow civil engineers. There's a bit of a renaissance and a movement within the field of civil engineering to sort of rethink and reimagine how we spend money on these systems. A lot of the billions and billions of dollars that we spend every year is still spent with a playbook from the 1970s. A lot of civil engineers were trained then. They're in their 50s and 60s. They do a brilliant job, especially in our smaller towns with really aging infrastructure. They're jack of all trades. They do an absolutely incredible job to keep things bootstrapped together and working. But as we move forward, as we invest billions of dollars every year, we have to bring innovation to the table. I've got pictures of these kind of silos and that just kind of symbolizes that we tend to manage a lot of our infrastructure systems by separate organizations in silos. So we have one utility or agency that manages wastewater, sometimes a different one that manages water supply, sometimes a different one for stormwater, certainly a different one for energy, parks, transportation, etc. When some of the smartest, most cost-effective, most value-generating kind of strategies bridge those silos. And so we just brought a bipartisan delegation on a tour of Denmark, and you'll see the utilities in Denmark typically will be multi-utilities. They'll have 5 or 6 utility companies under one holding company so that they can integrate and synergize their infrastructure investments. And so as we go forward, we should be looking for ways to kind of link across these silos and generate value in more than one infrastructure sector. So how do we do that? Seattle Public Utilities has really pioneered what they call value planning, but it's basically when the civil engineer says, hey, we need this $4 million project, the economists say that could definitely be the right answer. But before we actually commit $4 million to that project, we're going to do some due diligence. We're going to explore an array of alternatives and see if we can find one that will generate even more value over the long term. So they convene an interdepartmental, interdisciplinary team. They try to get people who are not within that silo, who can bring some creative perspective from other disciplines and other sectors to the team. They think about, are we framing the problem right? Is the challenge, is it really that we need a new pumping station, or do we need some more pressure over here? And is there other ways we could solve this problem? And they invite innovative ideas. You're encouraged to think out of the box. And then they distill out 3 or 4 of the best options, and they thoroughly compare the ROI for the top 3 or 4 proposals that come out, and they identify the ones with the best ROI for the system and for the community as a whole. And then, with all that information, the infrastructure decision makers say, okay, this is the project that we want to do. Sometimes it's the original one the civil engineer proposed, but often it's not. And they're saving millions and millions and millions of dollars every year through this investment discipline. So this is the new investment discipline that we need to bring to the spending that we're making on infrastructure systems. So we've done a series of reports kind of doing deep dives into the energy system, the future of the energy system, future of the water system. Right now we're doing waste management, and we talk to innovators and thought leaders, and we ask them this design question. If we're wildly successful in Oregon and Washington at building world-class infrastructure systems by 2040 that are super sustainable, that are really resilient, that are really affordable, that are integrated, rich in community value, what will that look like, and how do we get there? And so, for example, I spoke to the Northwest Energy Efficiency Leadership Forum about the energy report that emerged from those conversations. And these were CEOs and top execs at all the utilities you've heard of, 20 of the top utilities in the Northwest. And really what emerged was a shared vision where we all win. So can we have an energy system that performs better for the same or lower cost, gives our kids clean air, in which our utilities are financially healthy? And this was something that those CEOs could say, yeah, and they're all in sort of the pinnacle of their career, the last 5 or 10 years, and so this is an opportunity for them to think legacy and to think about their kids and their grandkids and what kind of system do we want to leave for them, in the same way our grandparents left us quality infrastructure. So it's been really encouraging to see how a lot of utilities have made some cool, bold moves. Radical revolution going on in their sector, in the energy sector, which was stable for a century, and now there's all this, this is the cost of technologies. Land-based wind dropped 40% in 8 years, distributed PV 50%, utility scale PV 64%. Radical cost reductions as economies of scale have gone up that completely disrupt and sort of overturn a century of stability in that sector that these CEOs are managing and trying to figure out how to make smart investments in that environment. So it's very challenging. Be sure to talk to Ken Dragoon about renewable hydrogen. He lobbied me hard to say something about that. So that's one of the technologies that will be emerging and disrupting the system. Here's just an example of the new solutions portfolio in water. So you've got water being managed more holistically across water supply, wastewater, stormwater, and flood infrastructure. You've got distributed infrastructure, micro infrastructure that can be blended in with the legacy systems. Smart sensors and cameras that allow you to see inside the pipes where you never could before, to see if there's problems, see if there's clogs, so you can pinpoint where you send out your maintenance crew. Green infrastructure at all scales. An absolute national star in clean water services based in Hillsborough in building broad partnerships to co-invest in watershed scale restoration. And then another Pacific Northwest superstar, Gresham wastewater treatment plant, really turning a wastewater treatment plant into a value factory, energy and fertilizer and other co-products. Just a principle, multi-purpose infrastructure. The best investments do more than one thing or deliver value to more than one system. That's a picture of a recycled water storage tank that's also a community park. So can we get the Parks Department and the wastewater treatment plant to co-invest so that we don't have ugly infrastructure, but maybe it could actually be a community asset as well as being a storage tank for water. In closing, just 2 quick slides. Industrial symbiosis, we brought 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats on a tour of Denmark looking at industrial symbiosis, which is a way that of clean manufacturing and clean production. They're saving a ton of money. They're reducing carbon emissions. Here's the bipartisan Denmark delegation from 2017. We brought another one in 2019. These people are working together across the partisan divide on solutions that can benefit communities in all parts of Washington state. We'd love to promote these kind of bipartisan approaches to our infrastructure future in Oregon as well, and work with you. Thank you for all the leadership that you're bringing to that quest. Really appreciate it. Okay, can you do that?
Sure. So, Reese, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Great words, and look forward to working and seeing what else comes. So, next we have a panel discussion. So, Senor Cummings, it's your turn. So, what does economic resiliency look like? We're going to see that through a number of different lenses. So, if we can go ahead and have the next panel come up and take a seat.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and we have a great panel put together for you today. We're going to have some presentations, we're going to have some movies, there's popcorn on your tables. It'll be there shortly, I think, actually, if it's not there now. But just go through a quick introduction of folks. On my far left here, we have Jed Jorgensen, am I pronouncing that correctly? With the Farmers Conservation Alliance, and Jed's going to talk about some fantastic piping and some areas where we can work together. To my direct left, your right, of course, we have Nick Green, who's the city manager of John Day. And for those of you who haven't been in John Day in a while, there's some fascinating stuff going on that we'll hear about. To my right, we have Leanne Welch, and who's a city engineer for Tillamook. And Dr. Christy Frost, correct? Foster. Foster.
There you go.
All right, I wrote that wrong. So thank you for correcting me. You're with the Tillamook Estuaries Partnership, correct?
Yes.
And you'll be both speaking together. We have a short presentation, of course, that you'll show about some flood control, correct? And then we have Sarah Rich, who's with Eco Northwest, and you're going to be talking about some work that your company did in the North Santiam. So why don't we go ahead and get started. Jed, I have you up first. If you want to take a microphone, you can have mine, of course, or Nick's.
Thank you. So, thank you, Chris. Thank you very much to folks with Business Oregon and everyone who helped with the organization of the conference. It's been really great. I want to start with a show of hands, or maybe it's a show of forks. Who here knows what an irrigation district does? That's well above average. Excellent. If you were busy eating and you didn't know, an irrigation district is a type of quasi-municipal government entity that works to deliver water to farmers and ranchers so that they can grow crops and raise livestock. And the infrastructure that they're using to do that is typically 80 to 100 years old, sometimes older, and as you might imagine, it's reaching the end of its useful life. So what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes really is some of the challenges associated with that aging infrastructure, as well as the benefits that can be accrued if we work to modernize it. I'm going to start off with the old infrastructure, and really because it's invisible to most folks, but it's also intimately tied to the food that we eat, as well as the health and well-being of our communities and our natural environment. Across the West, about 80% of the water that's consumed is being used by agriculture. And for most irrigation districts, delivering that water starts at a river. There's typically some kind of diversion structure, it might be a dam, might not, that moves the water out of the river and into, often, an open earthen main canal system. And from there, district staff, known as ditch riders, will work on a daily basis to open and close a series of gates that'll move the water into secondary canals. In those canals, then, the water will flow past farms throughout the district, and farmers can use pumps to take the water up out of the canals and deliver it to their crops. And that operation has to happen on a daily basis because typically there's not enough water to keep all of the canals filled at the same time. That means that a calendar schedule ends up getting set up for the farmers to be able to deliver the water, which may or may not be perfectly aligned with the optimal time to water their crops. So that's just one of the challenges. There's a whole set of challenges that come with this old infrastructure, though. To start with, when we think about that 80% of the water that's consumed in the West, something between 30 to 70% of it is not making it to a farm because it's seeping into the ground or evaporating first. And that varies based on the local geology and geography, but it's a huge problem, both for farmers and for our rivers, because neither are getting as much water as they need. There's a lot of other challenges as well. Debris is a huge issue, whether that's natural debris or whether that's stuff that might get thrown into a canal by other folks. There can be other contaminants, whether that's runoff from a road or runoff from farms. That's a problem both for farmers downstream who are pumping out of that system, as well as if any of that water is returning to stream, that's a water quality problem. In the summertime, in some areas, aquatic weeds are a big problem. And then in the wintertime, in other places, maybe snow knocks a tree down that falls on the canal wall, it weakens the wall, it causes a blowout that can cause downstream flooding and property damage. It's a huge issue. And then tragically, I think almost every summer I hear about an accidental drowning in a canal. So the situation's really challenging. It's challenging for the irrigation districts, for the farmers, and for our natural environment. And when we think about the scale of the infrastructure, there's several thousand miles of canals in Oregon alone. And as an aside, I really liked the infrastructure report card this morning, that session. But I couldn't help but notice the agricultural infrastructure isn't included there. And I guess I'd politely suggest that maybe it should be, especially when we consider, which we'll come to next, all of the benefits that can accrue by modernizing it, not just within farms and for agriculture, but to our environment and to our rural communities especially. So I want to pause for a second with my kind of litany of challenges and show a video that can unlock a video that talks about what an irrigation district of the future can unlock in terms of those benefits. So if our AV team in the back can kick off that video, that'd be great.
A staple in children's lunchboxes, and once described as the American fruit, the apple is at the core of many American milestones. Its seed helped guarantee success in settling the American West and continues to drive Western agriculture. That agriculture, though, is ripe for another milestone. At the root of farming is water infrastructure that is over a century old. 80% of the 1 million diversions in the West are for crops and livestock, and yet often half of that water is lost before it reaches the farms. Modernizing these aging systems will carry our nation into the next century. For a country and fruit that have led innovation, this work can be a catalyst for the next era of smart infrastructure. Replacing earthen canals with pressurized pipes creates a new infrastructure framework that can enable in-conduit hydropower, improve water quality, and return water to rivers and wildlife. That new framework can also be used as a path for fiber optic and electrical cable, enabling high-speed internet distribution, Wi-Fi integrations, and electrical vehicle charging stations. Those old canals, they can start collecting stormwater to help municipalities, while also creating new pollinator habitats. Combined, these collaborative efforts will improve food security, strengthen communities, create jobs, secure water resources, generate new energy, and reduce carbon output. 400 years ago, those apples couldn't cross the Atlantic without adapting to their new landscape. Now, the echoes of that resiliency are a call to action to revolutionize a way of life as American as apple pie for the next generation.
So I'll be the first to admit the video's not perfect and the music might be a little bit over the top for what we're talking about, which is the maybe not so radical concept of delivering water in a pipe. I think we might have mastered that as a society, but, and I know this is going to sound like hyperbole, I truly believe that modernizing these systems may represent one of the greatest opportunities in our generation to provide benefits both for agriculture, for our rivers, and for our environment, and to improve the economic, energy, and water security and resilience in our rural communities. And it's the magnitude of those potential benefits and their significance in our climate-impacted world that really get me up out of bed every day wanting to work on this program. So FCA got started in 2005. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we got started with this irrigation modernization program about 6 years ago, thanks to funding from Energy Trust of Oregon. The irrigation modernization program provides comprehensive implementation strategies that enable the installation of modern, flexible, and adaptable systems based on the objectives of the irrigation district in concert with the objectives and goals of other local community stakeholders. What we do is identify infrastructure improvements, funding opportunities, and strategic partnerships, as well as identifying all those agricultural, environmental, and community benefits that can go along with the projects. When we got started, we thought we might work with 3 or 4 irrigation districts in the first couple of years. Well, 12 signed up in the first year, and we're now working with 24 districts across the state that represent somewhere between 25 to 30% of the state's irrigated acres. Thanks to funding from Senator Jeff Merkley, we've secured about $75 million in federal funding for piping in the Deschutes Basin, and there's another $35 million in a Senate appropriation right now. And at the state level, we've had tremendous support from the Oregon Water Resources Department, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and DEQ's Clean Water State Revolving Fund. In different ways, the long-term security of all of these different funding sources is at risk, but for the success of this program, we absolutely need long-term, stable funding in order to be successful. With the funding that we have now in Central Oregon, we've been able to help kick off the construction and piping at Tumalo Irrigation District, and the Swally Irrigation District is getting started right now, and there's several other districts that are going to get going in the next couple of years. But really, the reason I'm most excited to be here today is to think through with you folks about those other ancillary benefits that we can accrue if we're really smart and strategic as we're starting to put the pipe in the ground. We know that if we put down another piece of conduit when we're laying the water pipe, that we can run fiber optic cable through that and provide for rural broadband at a fraction of the cost of a greenfield project. What we're just now starting to think about is, well, what if we include electrical distribution or transmission lines? Could we interconnect an in-conduit hydropower project that's made possible through surplus gravity pressure in that water pipe to a local community and make a microgrid that can keep that community electrified when the grid is down? We all saw what happened in California 2 weeks ago, and I think there's no question that we need to do more for our communities to help them keep the lights on when the grid is down. But we're just now starting to think that this project could also potentially be part of the solution for that. So I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more to this program, but these folks also have very interesting and equally amazing things that they're working on. So thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jed. Am I still here? Yes. I'm curious, your projects cross multiple districts, right? Maybe this one's not. Across multiple districts, it's irrigation districts go through cities and so on and so forth. How you've thought about adding this additional conduit or other infrastructure at the same time, how do you find do you have the manpower to tie all those other districts in to find financing at the same time? Or is that a key piece of financing that's missing?
You know, I don't think financing is going to, at the end of the day, be the challenge. What we're looking at with all of this infrastructure is how does it provide additional value back to the irrigation district to pay for the broader infrastructure package. So the adding in these additional pieces tends to be a really small additional cost compared to the rest of the large pipe that has to go in the ground. So if we can create additional revenue streams that can help to finance that broader package, that's really what we're trying to go for. And you know, we're really just at the beginning in terms of seeing these projects start to go to construction, and so we don't have a lot of experience yet. We're just getting ready to kind of start piloting, adding in some of those additional, I guess, revenue tools into these projects.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Green.
So I've got a couple of slides I'd just like to show kind of as a preview to the session I'll be covering shortly after this, which is John Day's contribution to the infrastructure discussion. And right now what we're contributing is part of that degrade to the wastewater. So if you can pull up that image, Rees Roth, he had a great point that we owe a debt of gratitude to our grandparents for the investments they've made in our infrastructure, but they thought differently than we did. So this is a picture of our aging wastewater treatment plant. It was constructed 72 years ago. It began construction, so we're now operating a 70-year-old wastewater treatment plant. And pictured on the left is the John Day River, which is waters of the state. So what were rivers good for 70 years ago? Productivity. They were for ranching and mining and timber and treating wastewater. And nobody really thought about what happens when these systems fail and they're 50 feet from waters of the state. And so that's the situation we're in now, where we've got configuration challenges, we're out of permit, we've got compliance issues and concerns about meeting future compliance at this location. It's in a regulated floodplain. And our Class B treated wastewater, because we're on a WPCF permit, is land applied. So it certainly isn't something we would create today. And so as we thought about the future and how do we create a new model that works within this paradigm that we're all operating in, the food, water, energy nexus, this is our flux capacitor. So I hit my head one night and this is what I came up with to take us back to the future. The concept is, can we take reclaimed water, what was an output of the wastewater treatment process that was land applied and eventually just returned to the water table, can we use that as an input into new industries, thirsty industries like controlled environment agriculture and data centers? And can offputs from those industries work in harmony with other industries like power generation so that we can create a virtuous cycle where inputs from one become outputs into the other, and vice versa. And so that's the model we were working with. And we set out to create this. So this was the concept. And as we went forward, we said, what is the engine that's going to drive this? And we came up with the WATERHUB, which is based on a similar model at Emory University in Atlanta. So creating a new water reclamation facility to replace our aging wastewater treatment plant that would incorporate greenhouse in design, both for tertiary treatment, but also to help stimulate growth in hydroponic greenhouses as a commercial industry. So the RFP for this facility was posted today and is out on the street for bid and will be constructed end of 2020 and into 2021. And from that facility, we went out and looked with our consulting staff, Anderson Perry and Sustainable Water out of Glen Allen, Virginia, at all the potential uses for reclaimed water within our community that are currently using fresh water. So we identified 65 million gallons a year just at the last remaining mill for log deck watering. They're using horizontal wells as a freshwater source. We can completely replace that, so do a one-for-one substitution there. We've got a variety of land applications that today use fresh water that could be converted to reclaimed water, another 48 million gallons a year. And then within the greenhouse industry and some of our future commercial and residential uses, almost another 26 million just in the greenhouse industry, and then more on commercial and residential. So this is just showing some of those new investments that will be fueled with this reclaimed water. The biomass energy facility at Malheur Lumber. This is a torrefaction facility. So it's taking that small diameter timber out of our forests. John Day is surrounded by about 2 million acres of public lands. Great timber harvests, but a lot of that small diameter, small woody biomass isn't good for construction, and so they're going to use it for this torrefaction facility, and it produces a product like the one shown in the bottom left. It's got the energy efficiency of coal with a much smaller carbon footprint. The other thing that we decided as part of this was we were going to lean into the controlled environment agriculture industry, so the city built the first commercial scale greenhouse. This went into operation this summer. It's pictured here. This facility will produce about 25 tons of farm-to-table produce annually. We run it as an extension of our wastewater treatment plant, and any benefit, any profit margin that's created as a result of this venture will accrue to our wastewater customers and help offset the cost of their treatment. It also makes a great cucumber and some wonderful lettuce. And pictured here is the produce that's currently under production within the greenhouse. We have one grocery store in John Day. We have about 3 in the entire county. And with our estimates, we'll actually be able to supply 100% of our local food needs for fresh produce in those SKUs and varieties that we're growing. So lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers, leafy greens, herbs. We will become 100% self-sufficient in our food production within the community, all fueled by reclaimed water from this new treatment plant. Thank you. I really appreciate the applause, because I thought for a moment people would think we're nuts. You got to be a little bit crazy to venture into this. We want to encourage the community to participate, and so as part of this plan, any future developments are going to be required by code to use reclaimed water where it's available. So any new industrial, commercial, or residential growth will have purple pipe networks connected throughout the entire community, and that's just our effort to help improve the environment, but also to capture the value of these resources that were previously viewed as liabilities, and trying to turn them into economic assets. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Nick. So I know that you've been the driving force behind all of this, and that's absolutely wonderful. And it's been a relatively short time frame that you've moved all this forward. So John Day, this is a substantial investment for a city of John Day's size. Did the community just jump on board, or were there some hurdles up front?
There were a few hurdles. Leading change is difficult. Getting people to embrace a new theory and a new economic model where we're going beyond just treating wastewater and we're trying to create economic value. I think it took time. There's still a few antagonists who are saying don't drink or don't eat that food. It's grown with sewer water. But if you look at the science, this is the cleanest, purest form of water we have, far cleaner than what's in the rivers and through many of our natural sources. So I think the community started to warm to the concept. And as they've seen the greenhouses come online, they're seeing the riverfront restoration work we're doing in conjunction with the treatment plant. I think they're starting to believe in this as an approach.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. Leanne?
Is this working? Is this working?
Yes.
Well, thank you for inviting us. Dr. Christy Foster and I will be co-presenting. So I first moved to Tillamook County in 2006. I was the county public works director, and in that, my 10 years there, we had 7 federally declared flood events. But in terms of the big floods, we annually have nuisance floods that we call them, once to twice a year, that closes down Highway 101 in the North Tillamook area. It closes businesses, so from Fred Meyer's to our hardware store, you've got Napa Auto Store, so a variety of businesses. So not only do those businesses close during that flood, but people can't get to work, so they're losing wages. So this has been going on historically for a long, long time. So it took a group, and of course, anywhere else that you'll see, and we've talked about this diversity that we have in our political spectrum, that it took a huge effort through the Oregon Solutions program. How many of you have heard of Oregon Solutions? So this was co-convened by Senator Betsy Johnson and Commissioner Mark Labhart at the time to bring together a diverse group of folks from both sides of the political spectrum to come up with a solution for this. And so actually, as Christy and I were putting this presentation together, there was actually a video that was made, so it's your second video today. This is a 10-minute video, but it really got all the points across, and we thought it was really well done. So we're going to show you this video of how we are addressing this severe flooding that impacts our economy so greatly several times a year, and then Christy's going to wrap it up at the end. So thanks.
The city of Tillamook, Oregon, located in the heart of Oregon's coastal dairylands, lies adjacent to Tillamook Bay. Designated as an estuary of national significance, Tillamook Bay is a diverse and productive ecosystem and watershed. Approximately 1 mile north of downtown Tillamook, the Southern Flow Corridor Landowner Preferred Alternative Project is located at the head of Tillamook Bay and at the confluence of the Wilson, Trask, and Tillamook rivers. This innovative project will restore 521 acres of tidal wetland habitat while reducing flooding to 3,000 acres of land in the community of Tillamook. The project, developed over many years through the efforts of a large and varied set of stakeholders, is unique, bringing federal government agencies together with state and local partners on a collaborative project that seeks to serve the needs of citizens, reduce flooding, provide economic benefits to the community, and restore important habitat for native fish and wildlife species.
Tillamook Bay in particular is unique in a couple of senses. It's one of the larger estuaries on the Oregon coast, and it's also been one of the most highly manipulated estuaries in terms of diking and filling and draining of wetlands. Well, a number of the fish species, particularly Chinook and coho, are really dependent on the estuary for their juvenile life stage. They come down to the estuary to rear. These are fish that are going to use the tidal channels, the fringes of estuary salt marshes for their rearing. And since the time Europeans settled this area till now, we've lost about 85% of the estuarine wetlands that these fish had historically.
I showed up down in Tillamook County. They had been wrestling with flooding that was very destructive economically. It was a problem for the reputation of the county. There had been multiple presidentially declared flood declarations, disaster declarations.
Here is the big reason most people cannot get into Tillamook tonight: a flood, basically surrounding the community, stranding drivers, making it virtually impossible to get in or out of Tillamook tonight. Motorists left their cars in the middle of what was once Highway 101. Today, a state of emergency was declared by Governor Kitzhaber.
Flooding is indigenous to this area, and it always has been. Last winter, last December, when it rained so much, it was the first year in the memory of anyone I've talked to, and I talk to people who are 90 years old regularly, first time they ever saw it flooded that much, 4 feet deep, and it came up on both sides of 101.
People were getting tired of trying to address flooding issues. And how do we fix it? And there was as many ideas as there were people about how to reduce flooding in Tillamook. Betsy and I were chosen by the governor as co-conveners, and then we started through the Oregon Solutions process.
Oregon Solutions is a collaborative problem-solving process, an opportunity for a group of frequently not like-minded folks to coalesce around a problem statement and postulate a solution and then work to effectuate that.
And that's where the Southern Flow Corridor project came through.
I've been working on this project for more than a decade. The project area is 640 acres, and by the time we're done, we will have restored 521 acres into a range of habitats from mudflat to high salt marsh. During a flood, the water crosses 101 and immediately hits a whole series of cross levees and old dredge material disposal sites. It backs up when it hits those obstacles, flows north along 101 and floods the north end of town. The flood reduction component of this project is to remove those levees and dredge material sites to create a corridor for the water to reach the bay. Once you remove those levees, you open up a whole series of ancient channels. So you create 14 miles of habitat for salmon at the confluence of major salmon-producing rivers. And I can imagine there may be an increasing number of folks who come to this area to watch the newly emerged portion of the bay as it evolves. This project has a myriad of benefits for fish and for people.
My father moved up here from Ontario, California in 1977, so I'm the second generation to run this particular dairy here. The project in one form or another has been going on since the late 90s. It's been controversial. It's been a long road. Where some of the controversy comes in on a local level is loss of agricultural property, but this is important for Tillamook and Oregon, and so we took another look at it and approached it from a different angle. We wanted to help navigate that conversation to a conclusion to where we're at today. The goals of the project has been to maximize the flood reduction benefits that we can get out of it by maintaining as much usable agricultural properties adjacent to any restoration work that's done in that area, and also create opportunities to enhance the farmability of those properties and we're feeling pretty good about it.
Theoretically, it's supposed to drop the water about 18 inches on the fringes of the flood. Well, that is where a lot of people live, and that was pretty exciting.
But we're trying to control that last inch or foot that creates the in my home scenario. And the trauma and the stress that's involved in that kind of event for somebody, I mean, it's devastating.
You know, thousands of acres this is going to help out of people with residents out and about and farmers. It's kind of a win-win for us.
This area we're standing in right here is the Wilson Trask wetland, then known as the Tillamook wetlands, and now it's known as the Southern Flow Corridor. The school has used this area since 2005 as an outside laboratory, so we bring students here from second grade all the way through the community college. We've been doing a lot of invasive species mapping. There's an awful lot of invasive plants out in this area, so in flooding those with salt water is probably going to do a lot to return this area away from its non-native condition back towards a native condition as to what it was before they built all the dikes that are around this area. And it's going to be fun to come back now and use it as a living laboratory as it changes back into a tidal wetland. So it'll be different. It'll be a whole different habitat, but it's going to be a really fantastic opportunity.
Pre-construction activities began at the project site in February of 2016. The contractor, Thompson Brothers Excavating, mobilized to the site the first week in May to begin construction in earnest. Activities included the demolition of former farm buildings, the removal of a house, the clearing of brush and trees, the removal of existing levees, the construction of new levees farther away from the estuary, the elimination and relocation of tide gates, the excavation of approximately 234,000 cubic yards of fill, the excavation and connection of tidal channels, and the remediation of contaminated fill materials at a former mill site. Permitting and funding the project required a substantial investment from federal agency partners who recognized its potential benefits not just for fish and wildlife, but also for the community. A new model that could be adopted by future projects nationwide. Project construction concluded in November of 2016. Post-construction monitoring operations begin in 2017.
Getting to follow this site whose context we understand really well so we know what makes it tick, and getting to measure those things that make it tick and follow it through its restoration process, that alone is really exciting and wonderful. Effectiveness monitoring is measuring things to see whether the restoration worked or not. So often for the first year or two after you remove the dikes and the tide water is coming back in, it's very wet, and the plants that are there don't really like this new set of conditions and they're going to die back. All that dying vegetation produces a ton of food for insects. And so often that's very productive for fish. The young salmon are going to be in there in force eating all of the different little insects that are feeding on that decaying vegetation. And also lots of shorebirds and waterfowl, and it'll support a whole lot of life at every stage of its restoration.
In terms of Chinook and coho populations in Tillamook Bay, if you compare what we have now to what we believe we had historically, we may have had as many as 200,000 coho coming back on average. Now, if we get 20,000 to Tillamook Bay, that's a pretty decent year. Chinook maybe not as heavily impacted. We estimate the population probably averages around 15,000 fish. Historically, it was probably more like 50 or 60,000. In terms of benefits to fish and fisheries, this project is going to restore about 28% of the habitat that's currently available. Mother Nature is going to take over and shape the area like she sees fit. We estimate that that increased production could be as much as 7,000 adult fish return on a good year. So that's huge. They're certainly iconic species and we need to protect them, and the more that we have, the happier everybody's going to be.
You have 5 major river systems that flow into essentially a very small area. What's the resolution to this? You're not just going to move all the businesses out of town. You're not just going to buy up all the dairies. You're not going to say, well, let's just dam the rivers up. You've got to work together to say, okay, this is what we have. Now let's figure out what we have and how can we make this work.
The Southern Flow Corridor project is the culmination of a huge community exercise designed to try to harmonize divergent points of view about how to fix a chronic problem in Tillamook County.
We're going to save the best farmland in the project, reducing flooding over 3,000 acres and benefiting 540 structures. That's a big benefit from a 640-acre project area.
We are the estuary. Everybody here in Tillamook is part of that estuary. We all need to work on having a healthy estuary. We all participate in it, we all benefit from it. And without a healthy estuary, we're not going to have a robust dairy community here. It really moves into a win-win situation as long as we always continue to bring everybody together.
Okay. There we go. All right, thank you. So this was a recently completed project, and if you take a look at some of the ecological and socioeconomic outcomes of this, we did have over 500 acres restored, and we're reconnecting over 1,400 miles of off-channel rearing. We're improving our water quality, and we have actually been able to impact much more than what is already shown on this slide. To give you an idea, we finished in November of 2016, and in less than a year, we had an as-built validation opportunity. We had one of those nuisance floods that Leanne mentioned, and this was equivalent to a 5-year event on the Wilson River or a 3-year event on the Trask, and it was similar to one that had happened in 1999. And so even though we haven't had the benefit yet of nature kind of taking its course after the project, in that short amount of time, we were able to see an 8-inch reduction along flooding along Highway 101 corridor. So that is really phenomenal impact, and that is really close to making a big difference as far as when Leanne again was talking about shutting down businesses and the economic impact to our city. We also saw 3 to 4 hours of reduction in the duration of the flood, and 4,800 acres showed reduction in peak flood level. And we only expect this to get better as we see the biological impacts of the project. So Tillamook Estuaries Partnership is going to take over the leading role now in the long-term monitoring, at least from the restoration and conservation point of view. So we are working with different environmental consultants to study the hydrology. We've installed some permanent monitoring stations. We are also working with the Institute of Applied Ecology to look at structural outcomes such as soil sedimentation, accretion, channel morphology, and some of the priority biological outcomes. So specifically, we're looking at fish, but we're also concerned with the fish prey, plants that are going to be taking over the communities, birds that we're already seeing an increase in the bird population in this area, and of course, anytime that you're going to be introducing perhaps more standing water, the community was concerned about the mosquito population, so we're doing mosquito surveys as well. And then the final thing that we're looking at as part of the long-term monitoring are the impacts and benefits of this project to climate change impacts, such as greenhouse gas flux. We're looking at methane and nitrogen oxides, and we're also looking at carbon sequestration. So we only have beginning news now. We only expect it to get even better, and this was a long-term project with a lot of partners, and we're kind of using this now as our template of how to make something like this succeed.
Well, that's great. It's a fabulous project, right? And I'm sure that while a lot of folks know the work that you did, there's probably still a lot of folks who just know it doesn't flood, right? I'm curious, so on the time frame, because the one gentleman in the video had said he was working on it for 10 years. It seemed like your construction time frame of the overall project was pretty quick.
The construction phase was only about a year. Once they got going, then that was pretty quick. But yeah, all the lead up to that took a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nope, wonderful project. Thank you. Sarah, you're on.
All right, so I'll wrap it up here with a description of a project that we've been working on for the last couple of years, helping the North Santiam Watershed Council understand the economic importance of water coming out of the North Santiam watershed. And this project didn't begin here. It was a collaborative effort between the Oregon Business Council and the North Santiam Watershed Council and its stakeholders who had been going through a pretty extensive drought planning process and working together, building some bridges, and then looking at possible big ticket investment needs in the watershed to build resiliency in the future with climate change and potential droughts, habitat challenges. So they came to us and said, we have some projects that we're thinking about. Can you help us think through the economics on this? And we talked with them for a little while and realized that what was underlying a lot of, they had big, interest in raising money and making these big investments, but they had a lot of questions about just some of the fundamental basic data needs that they required to make the case for those investments. So we said, we can help you with that. Let's understand what the economic value of the resource that you're managing is. Let's get some baseline data, and then we can take that and build it into some pretty robust economic analyses of these individual projects. You'll be able to take that information and prioritize and build coalitions and leverage additional funding if you can really show the value of the resource that you're managing. So we jumped into this, and it was an interesting, so there's a map of the North Santiam. You all, we're not far from that. It's a little slice of land here in the Mid-Valley, but it actually has a really big impact where that water is going. So we jumped into this in the midst of a lot of other ongoing things. You've heard about some of these things. Danielle presented on the challenges that the communities in the upper watershed, where the canyon communities were facing with their wastewater challenges. And at the same time, the Army Corps was going through a process of understanding what it was going to do to make improvements to Detroit Dam. And in the midst of the work that we started doing, the city of Salem started to feel the impact of the algae blooms of rivers. So we were trying to understand the value of water originating in the North Santiam while all of these different things are going on. Created an interesting backdrop for this work. So like I said, the original question that was presented to us was, help us understand the benefit costs of these projects that we might be considering. And so this diagram shows how we might begin to do that, and it starts with understanding what that investment is and how it changes. As economists, we think in terms of forms of capital, so how it changes the stock of capital or the tools that the economy, the resources that the economy has to produce things that people value. And that was where we really started having this conversation. What is the value of that capital, and what are the value of the goods and services that the watershed is currently producing? We think that it's pretty valuable, but without that information, it's hard to understand how investments in the watershed would change those things. So this was the framework that we started with when we went in to understand the value of the water in the watershed, coming out of the watershed. So we apply what we call the economic importance of water framework, starting with things that you probably have heard in Econ 101. What's the supply of water? But also, what's the supply of water? What's the supply of other forms of infrastructure or forms of capital that are required to make the best use of that water? What are the uses underlying the demand for that water? And when you overlay all of those things, you can start to understand what the economic value of that water is. And then importantly, based on the work that they've been doing with their drought planning and other factors happening in the watershed, what are the trends that are going to affect water supply and availability and demand for water in the future? And how is that going to change the potential value of water over time? So we came to some conclusions in that, and based on our study, we developed some rough magnitude estimates these are order of magnitude estimates of the value of water. It's not meant to be precise, but it's meant to provide some context for these planning discussions and understanding how best to invest in the watershed. And so we knew, they knew a lot of the uses, they knew, what was going on in the watershed, but there wasn't a clear understanding of how it all was related and how it related to each other in terms of order of magnitude from an economic perspective. So we knew that in-stream flow was important, and that was a lot of what the Corps was needing to do in terms of its infrastructure improvements in Detroit Dam for fish species. We know that a lot of the water is dedicated in the North Sandium to providing fish habitat, and there's some important value there related to threatened and endangered species. So we were able to put a value on that. We know that in-stream flow also supports a lot of value in recreation, both downstream, down below the dam, in terms of boating and fishing, but also reservoir-based recreation behind the dam. That's a favorite place for a lot of people. A lot of people have been going for generations, and it holds special value to Oregonians, not just in the watershed, but from all over the state and people coming from even further. So that demand for the water in the watershed is coming from outside of the watershed. And it's also supported by the other forms of infrastructure, particularly up in the reservoir area, the communities that provide other sources of value, that allow people to use that water for recreation, the docks, and then the supplies that they go and buy up there, and that other infrastructure, the tourism infrastructure in the upper communities. We also know that as that water flows down, it supports property values and other things in the watershed. I'll get back to that in a minute. We know that the dam produces electricity, low carbon electricity. We know that water is used within the watershed for municipal and industrial uses, but a huge part of that conversation is the fact that the water is diverted outside of the watershed into the pipes for the city of Salem and points south. And that municipal and industrial demand has a huge amount of value. And then the water is also diverted outside of the basin for irrigated agriculture. And they're looking at ways to do that more efficiently and looking at their own investments. And then there are other values that are tremendously important but unquantifiable, not appropriate to quantify in monetary terms: cultural, tribal, spiritual value, and then some a lot of value in terms of public health and well-being that's a little trickier to put a dollar value on, but needs to be part of that conversation. Okay, there we go. So put all of this together, and we have a number, and the question then is, what do they do with this? As we were going through the process, we realized, and the stakeholders in the process realized, that the value isn't just the value of water for fish, or the value of water for agriculture, or the value of water for municipal services. The way that the water flows through the watershed and outside of the watershed, it underscores the connections and interdependencies between these uses. And so what that is helping the community and the stakeholders to think through is, how can we expand and produce extra value in these investments by capitalizing on those interconnections? When we think about the wastewater investments in the wastewater infrastructure, it's not just about providing water for those wastewater services for the small population up in the canyon. It's also about providing and helping to support the recreation economy in that part of the basin, which we know is really valuable, and providing and ensuring clean water for all of those users downstream. The diversion and transmission efficiency investments that they were looking at that enables the city of Salem to access that watershed as a water supply, and it's shared with the infrastructure that allows the irrigators to access it, and also provides water that flows through Mill Creek here for a good part of the year. And so that supports aesthetic value. Here in the capital, people probably don't always make that connection that water's coming from outside, or from that watershed, being diverted out, but providing a tremendous amount of value through. So, and then understanding how investments in in-stream habitat improvements, can be layered on top of those other infrastructure needs. And anyway, so the study provided a baseline snapshot on an annual basis of this value from the North Santiam, and now the watershed is looking at how they can take that information and make the case for these needed investments, and really appealing to all of the people who are benefiting from the quality and quantity of that water flowing out across the state to potentially continue to support that.
Well,
I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's quite interesting. I could see many places across the state that this could be
absolutely
modeled in. Have you any interest from other folks, or
well, this started,
you don't have to give away clients? I'm just.
No, this started. The Oregon Business Council saw the work that we were doing along these lines up in Washington. We've been working for probably the better part of a decade plus, helping the folks up in the Yakima River Basin do this exact process, and they're much further along now in getting money and actually making some of these investments. But that project has allowed really, contentious relationships, people to come together and shake hands and say, we're going to do this because my project, benefits from my money invested in my project I'm going to support your project, and we're going to get the investment together. And doing these two projects at the same time is going to produce bigger value for the community. And so there's been a lot of social capital development up there, which then has made it possible to get money that they may not have otherwise had and solve these really intractable problems. But that economic analysis has helped them. Other places in the state, we have several other communities that we've been talking with, and we'll see where it goes. But definitely.
You're not going to give me the list? No, okay. Kind of a time check? Yeah, the lights are right in my eye. I can't really see that. Sorry. 5 minutes. Thank you. Since there's 5 minutes, I just want to wrap it up here. I did notice across the spectrum here, there are a few things that come into play. Obviously, that social capital, right, getting folks all on the same page. These are certainly innovative projects, I think, particularly for Oregon or across the country. But one thing that seems to strike me with all these projects is that there is a champion somewhere. There's a champion for all the projects, right? In John Day's case, you're the champion sitting right next to me. We have a belt in the back for you. But I think that's really what it is that there are people like all of you in the crowd that are willing to take on a project and stick with a project and not say that it can't be done, right? Because it can be done. It's just a matter of getting the right people in the room, getting the right conversations together, and moving forward with each project. So for that, I really thank you for all your work and what you do for Oregon, the communities that you live in, and it's much appreciated.